January 19th, 1943. Point Cruz sector, Guadalcanal. Corporal Davis is found dead near a creek. At the aid station, the only conclusion anyone can make with confidence is limited. A single rifle shot, a steep enough angle to suggest the shooter was not on the same level ground, and no immediate sign of where the fire came from. No one in his squad saw the shooter. In jungle terrain, even the sound of a rifle report can be distorted. Men often realize the direction only after the casualty is already down. Within 72 hours, 13 more soldiers from the 132nd Infantry Regiment die under similar circumstances. Single shots. Apparent elevated fire. No visible enemy. In several cases, the first indication of contact is not a crack of a rifle, but a man collapsing. The pattern is consistent with trained marksman activity, whether formal snipers by modern definition or skilled riflemen operating with sniper-like discipline in concealment and target selection. The battalion commander faces a tactical problem that reveals a deeper institutional gap. The 132nd Infantry Regiment, like most U.S. Army infantry units in early 1943, has no dedicated counter-sniper capability as a standardized, resourced function. No formally trained sniper specialists in the unit's normal structure. No scoped rifles in the standard table of organization and equipment. No established, widely taught doctrine for locating and neutralizing enemy marksmen operating from concealed positions in jungle terrain. American infantry doctrine in this period emphasizes volume of fire delivered by semi-automatic rifles at squad level. The M1 Garand, standard issue since the mid-1930s, embodies this philosophy. 8-round capacity, semi-automatic action, and a practical, effective range commonly taught around 500 yards with iron sights under ideal conditions, though the jungle rarely offers ideal conditions. The doctrine assumes that massed, coordinated fire from standard infantry weapons will suppress or eliminate threats, including individual marksmen. Suppression is a powerful tool when you can identify where the threat is. That assumption is being tested in the coconut groves west of Point Cruz, and 14 Americans are dead. The battalion needs a solution the institutional army has not provided as a routine capability. What happens next will be improvised, field-expedient, and it will expose a gap in American military preparation that should not have existed, or at minimum, should have been acknowledged and mitigated sooner. To understand why the 132nd Infantry Regiment lacked counter-sniper capabilities in January 1943, we need to examine the doctrinal choices made during the interwar period. U.S. Army infantry doctrine between 1918 and 1941 evolved in response to World War I's lessons. The dominant conclusion: modern warfare requires rapid, coordinated fire delivered by infantry squads equipped with standardized weapons, supported by machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The emphasis was on unit firepower and maneuver, methods that scale across large formations. The 1940 edition of FM 23-5 Basic Field Manual, U.S. Rifle Caliber, 30. M1 emphasizes the employment and care of the standard rifle and the fundamentals of marksmanship as they apply to the average rifleman. It is not a manual for building a dedicated sniper system with formal selection, paired employment, optical issue, and counter-sniper procedures. Sniper training, known to the U.S. Army in World War I, did not remain a consistently institutionalized specialty across the interwar years. As priorities shifted toward broader modernization and the rapid expansion of a mass army, by contrast, other militaries made different choices. The Imperial Japanese Army entered the Pacific War with an established culture of fieldcraft and concealment, shooting shaped by years of campaigning in Asia. Japanese forces employed trained marksmen and, when available, scoped rifles intended for precision work. One example was the Type 97 sniper rifle, a scoped variant based on the Arisaka Type 38 pattern, which was adopted in the late 1930s and used where procurement and distribution allowed. German and Soviet forces similarly maintained formal sniper programs through the interwar period, and in wartime expanded them dramatically. Their doctrine treated the skilled marksman as a force multiplier, particularly valuable in defensive fighting, in broken terrain, and in environments where observation and restraint could produce outsized results. The U.S. Army did not follow this pattern in a uniform, Army-wide way. Resources during the 1930s focused on basic infantry training, unit cohesion, and preparing for large-scale mechanized warfare, especially as planners anticipated European-style operations. Specialized marksmanship existed, but it was not consistently developed into a standardized counter-sniper capability embedded across infantry units as a routine expectation. This doctrinal framework worked adequately in many circumstances. The M1 Garand proved superior to bolt-action rifles in close-range infantry combat. American emphasis on squad tactics and fire superiority produced effective results in conventional engagements where enemy positions could be fixed and suppressed. But doctrine always contains assumptions about the nature of future combat. And when those assumptions meet terrain and enemy tactics, they did not anticipate, or did not prioritize, gaps appear. Guadalcanal in early 1943 presented such a gap. Japanese forces, withdrawing westward after losing the initiative around Henderson Field, established defensive positions in coconut plantations and dense jungle. The terrain offered long sightlines, 300 to 500 yards in some areas, broken by vegetation that provided concealment, broken shadows, and countless firing angles. It was terrain that could reward patience more than aggression. Japanese marksmen exploited this terrain effectively. Operating from elevated positions in banyan and coconut trees, they could observe American movement patterns while remaining difficult to detect from ground level. Their practice emphasized restraint, limited shots, long waits, and careful position choice, often with routes to withdraw or shift after firing. Whether every shooter followed a formal doctrine or simply good field sense, the practical result was the same. The Americans struggled to locate the threat in time to respond. American infantry tactics, designed for different terrain and different threats, struggled to respond. Standard procedure called for suppressive fire when contact was made. But suppressive fire requires a visible target or at least a reliable source direction. In thick vegetation, sound can mislead, muzzle flash can be hidden, and a shooter firing once from cover can vanish into 1,000 possible hides. Japanese marksmen rarely provided the kind of repeated fire that makes suppression effective. Artillery could be called on suspected sniper positions, but this required precise location data. Even when a tree could be identified, a shooter operating from treetops, dozens of feet above ground, could relocate before fire missions were adjusted, or simply shift to another position while the jungle swallowed the observer's ability to track him. Patrols could search for snipers, but walking through jungle where a hidden rifleman might be watching from any one of hundreds of elevated positions created understandable hesitation. Searching for a concealed shooter is not simply bravery, it is a calculation, and the terrain was rigged against the searcher. By late January 1943, this tactical stalemate was eroding operational effectiveness. Patrols slowed, water resupply became hazardous. Movement through certain sectors required increasingly elaborate security measures. Commanders began spending time managing fear and friction rather than pushing the mission forward. The battalion commander needed a capability to locate and neutralize enemy marksmen. The institutional army had not provided one as a routine tool set in that unit. The search for a counter-sniper solution led to Second Lieutenant John George. George's background was unusual for an infantry officer in 1943. Before the war, he had competed in civilian marksmanship competitions, including the Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards, which he won in 1939 at age 23. That record mattered not as a trophy, but because it suggested disciplined fundamentals under conditions where small errors become large misses. Competitive long-range shooting is a distinct discipline from combat marksmanship. It requires understanding of external ballistics, wind reading, trigger control, and consistent shooting position, skills not emphasized in standard Army rifle qualification, which was designed to produce competent general riflemen at common engagement ranges. George had also purchased civilian equipment suited to this discipline. A Winchester Model 70 bolt-action rifle in .30-06 Springfield caliber, fitted with a Lyman Alaskan 2.5x telescopic sight. This was personal property, not military issue, and its value was not the brand or the romance of civilian gear, but the simple advantage of magnified observation and a rifle configured for deliberate precision. When George deployed with the 132nd Infantry Regiment, he brought this rifle with him, shipping it through military mail channels. This was not explicitly prohibited by regulations, though it was unusual. His company commander reportedly expressed skepticism about the utility of a bolt-action sporting rifle in modern infantry combat. Skepticism that was reasonable in many firefights where volume mattered more than single-shot accuracy. For several weeks after the 132nd's arrival on Guadalcanal, George had no opportunity to employ the Winchester in combat. The regiment's initial operations, including the assault on Mount Austin in late December 1942, involved close-range fighting in dense jungle where the Garand's semi-automatic capability and larger magazine capacity offered clear advantages. At those ranges, speed could mean survival. By late January, the tactical situation had changed. Following the casualties attributed to enemy marksmen, battalion command sought soldiers with relevant marksmanship experience. George's competitive shooting background and possession of a scoped rifle made him a candidate for an improvised counter-sniper role, not because the system had planned for it, but because the crisis demanded something different than ordinary infantry response. Historical records do not preserve the exact conversation, and any reconstruction of the commander's words should be treated cautiously. But the operational outcome is documented. George was tasked with attempting to locate and engage enemy shooters using his personal rifle. This assignment reflected field expediency rather than doctrinal procedure. George had no formal sniper training, no designated spotter, no established protocols for reporting kills or coordinating with other units. Confirmation in jungle terrain is never as clean as it looks on paper, and the reality of this work was messy. Observation, inference, and judgment under conditions designed to defeat all three. He was being asked to improvise a solution to a tactical problem the institutional army had not prepared him or anyone else in the regiment to solve as a standard capability. On the morning of January 22, 1943, George positioned himself in the ruins of a captured Japanese bunker overlooking the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. The specifics of what followed are documented primarily through George's own later account in Shots Fired in Anger, 1947, supplemented by what unit materials and later summaries can corroborate about the broader tactical effect. Where precise details rely on George's narrative, they should be understood as a first-hand account, valuable, but not the same as a perfectly audited combat log. According to George's account, he spent the early morning hours observing potential firing positions through his Lyman Alaskan scope, The 2.5x magnification, modest by modern standards, provided enough detail to distinguish movement in tree canopy that would be invisible to the naked eye at 200 to 300 yards. Just as important, the scope did not merely aid shooting, it aided detection. In counter-sniper work, seeing comes before firing. Competitive shooting had trained George to remain motionless for extended periods while glassing a target area, a skill directly applicable to counter-sniper work, where impatience creates exposure, and exposure creates casualties. At approximately U9-117 hours, George observed movement in a banyan tree at an estimated range of 240 yards. The movement pattern suggested human activity rather than wind or animal presence. In jungle terrain, that distinction is everything. Leaves move constantly, but certain movements, too deliberate, too periodic, reveal intent. George engaged with a single shot. According to his account, the target, an enemy shooter, fell from the tree. Whether every such target was a formally trained sniper or a skilled rifleman is less important than the immediate tactical reality. A hidden shooter was removed, and the battalion's men could move with slightly less fear for a few hours. This engagement established several important tactical facts. First, a scoped rifle could effectively engage targets at ranges where iron-sighted Garands struggled to achieve consistent precision hits on partially concealed targets. The Garand could reach out, but it was not optimized for picking a small, shadowed shape out of a tree line with deliberate, single-shot certainty. Second, elevation provided significant advantages for locating shooters. George's position in the bunker ruins gave him a view into tree canopy that ground-level patrols lacked, changing the geometry of concealment. Third, enemy shooters appeared to be operating in patterns. Elevated positions with fields of fire toward known American routes, patterns that could be studied, anticipated, and exploited. Over the next several hours, George engaged additional targets using similar tactics. Enemy marksmen, operating under the assumption that American forces lacked an effective counter-sniper presence, maintained positions longer than they might have if they believed they were being actively hunted by optics and patient observation. George's presence changed that calculation. By mid-morning on January 23rd, hostile shooter activity in the immediate area had noticeably decreased. This could reflect several factors: casualties among shooter teams, tactical relocation to different sectors, or operational adaptation to the new threat. In a jungle fight, the absence of fire is not always proof of success, but it is often the first measurable sign that the enemy is changing behavior. The key tactical outcome was measurable in effect, even if imperfect in accounting. American casualties from concealed long-range shots in Georgia's immediate operational area appear to have dropped sharply during this period, based on contemporary accounts and the broader narrative of the crisis easing, even if exact numbers and causation cannot be perfectly audited. However, the enemy adapted. On January 23rd, Georgia's position came under mortar fire, suggesting Japanese forces had located his firing area, likely through sound triangulation, observation, or inference from the direction of fire. George relocated and continued operations from different positions over the following days. This was a duel of learning, not merely marksmanship. Every shot created information, and information created counteraction. This pattern, engagement, enemy adaptation, American counter-adaptation, reflected evolving tactical interaction rather than one-sided dominance. Enemy marksmen in later engagements showed greater caution, shorter exposure times, more frequent position changes, and in some cases the use of decoy positions intended to draw a shot and reveal the counter-sniper's location. George adapted in turn, employing longer observation periods and more careful analysis of potential targets before engaging. The work shifted from simply seeing movement to interpreting intent, deciding what was bait, what was genuine, and what was merely jungle noise. The exact number of enemy shooters killed during this period is difficult to verify with precision. George's post-war account claims 11 confirmed kills over 4 days. Other documentation supports a significant reduction in the effectiveness of enemy marksmen in that sector during the same window, which strengthens the case for operational impact without requiring blind acceptance of precise enemy casualty figures that are inherently difficult to confirm in jungle canopy. What can be stated with confidence? George's improvised counter-sniper operations successfully reduced a tactical threat that had been inflicting steady casualties on the 152nd Infantry Regiment. The success of George's operations prompted a response from higher command levels, but the response itself reveals the institutional gap that made improvisation necessary. Following George's initial success, battalion and regimental commanders requested resources to expand counter-sniper capability. Division headquarters located a limited number of scoped Springfield rifles, some associated with marine practice and target-style externally adjusted optics, others reflecting Army sniper variant procurement, equipment already in theater through earlier issue, redistribution, or units rotating off the island. The exact mix of models and mounts could vary, and what mattered most was the reality that these rifles were scarce, not standard, and had to be gathered through improvisation rather than drawn as normal issue. The Army units had no equivalent widespread program that ensured every regiment arrived with trained teams and standardized optics, which is why available scoped rifles, whatever their precise configuration, were being redistributed and concentrated where the need was urgent. George was assigned to organize and train a provisional sniper section, using these scoped rifles and approximately 40 soldiers identified as expert marksmen during basic training. This designation indicated above-average rifle qualification scores, but not specialized sniper training, and certainly not an automatic ability to hunt concealed shooters in complex terrain. Over approximately 1 week in late January 1943, George conducted improvised training focusing on fundamentals: breathing control, trigger discipline, wind estimation, target identification at extended range, fieldcraft, and the discipline of observation. In practice, the most difficult skill was not pulling the trigger. It was staying still long enough to learn what the jungle was hiding. This was field-expedient instruction, not formal doctrine. George was drawing on civilian competitive shooting experience and his recent combat experience, not established military training protocols. In effect, the Army was outsourcing institutional learning to a lieutenant because the battlefield had demanded an answer faster than the bureaucracy could supply one. By early February, the provisional sniper section was operational. According to available summaries and accounts, the section conducted operations through mid-February 1943, achieving documented success in reducing hostile marksman activity in assigned sectors, though exact tallies of enemy casualties should be treated with the same caution that applies to all jungle warfare accounting. The institutional significance of this episode extends beyond tactical outcomes. George's improvised solution demonstrated that, first, scoped rifles could effectively engage targets at ranges and under concealment conditions where standard infantry weapons and iron sights struggled to deliver consistent precision. Second, specialized training in marksmanship principles and observation discipline improved soldier effectiveness in counter-sniper roles. Third, dedicated counter-sniper operations could significantly reduce casualties from concealed enemy fire by changing enemy behavior as much as by removing individual shooters. These were not new discoveries. Other militaries had established these principles earlier. But for the U.S. Army in early 1943, they represented lessons learned through field necessity rather than peacetime preparation. The question this raises: why was field improvisation necessary? The lessons from Guadalcanal did not immediately transform Army doctrine. Following the campaign, some units began experimenting with sniper sections using whatever scoped rifles could be obtained. The Army ground forces conducted limited studies on sniper employment, but formal doctrine, standardized training programs, and dedicated equipment remained uneven through much of the war, often depending on command interest, available rifles, and the presence of men with unusual prior experience. This pattern, field innovation preceding institutional adoption, appeared repeatedly across different theaters. In Italy, some units improvised sniper operations using captured German scoped rifles. In Northwest Europe, certain divisions organized informal sniper sections. In each case, success depended on individual initiative rather than systematic preparation, and the quality of results varied accordingly. The Marine Corps moved somewhat faster. Building on existing traditions and the Guadalcanal experience, Marines expanded sniper training and doctrine during 1943 to 1944. But even Marine programs remained limited in scale and could be inconsistent across units, shaped by equipment availability and operational demand. The U.S. Army did not establish formal sniper schools until the Korean War. Systematic sniper doctrine, formal training pipelines, standardized equipment, and long-term institutional recognition emerged far more clearly only during the Vietnam era. This timeline reflects institutional realities. Military organizations learn slowly, particularly when lessons challenge existing doctrine. American infantry doctrine in 1940-1943 emphasized squad-level fire superiority using semi-automatic rifles. This doctrine worked effectively in many contexts. Acknowledging that specialized marksmanship and counter-sniper capability also had decisive value required adjusting established frameworks, a process that institutional militaries approach cautiously, especially in wartime, when retooling training and procurement competes with immediate operational demands. The cost of this caution was measured in casualties suffered before effective responses were improvised, and in the variability of those responses across different units and theaters. George's experience on Guadalcanal demonstrated what prepared counter-sniper capability could achieve. But translating one lieutenant's field improvisation into Army-wide doctrine required institutional processes that moved over years, not weeks. After Guadalcanal, George served in the Burma campaign with the 5307th Composite Unit, Provisional, known as Merrill's Marauders. According to his later account, jungle terrain in Burma offered fewer opportunities for long-range precision shooting than Guadalcanal's coconut groves, and combat there often collapsed into closer-range engagements shaped by terrain, exhaustion, and disease as much as marksmanship. George returned to the United States in 1944, was promoted to captain, and spent the remainder of the war on training duties. In 1947, he published Shots Fired in Anger, a detailed technical account of infantry weapons and their employment in the Pacific Theater. The book became a reference work among firearms historians and remains in print. George's Winchester Model 70 was eventually donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia, where it is displayed with documentation of its service on Guadalcanal. The rifle itself is unremarkable in appearance, a standard civilian sporting rifle of the late 1930s, distinguished only by its documented combat employment. What it represents, however, extends beyond individual marksmanship. The Winchester is physical evidence of a gap between institutional doctrine and tactical reality. It demonstrates what happens when field improvisation becomes necessary because peacetime preparation proved insufficient, or because recognized threats were not prioritized as urgent capabilities across the force. The U.S. Army in 1943 possessed enormous industrial capacity, logistical sophistication, and tactical competence. But in the specific domain of counter-sniper operations, it entered the war without a standardized, widely distributed capability, relying on individual soldiers and local commanders to improvise solutions to problems that institutional foresight could have addressed more systematically. This pattern, doctrine lagging behind tactical necessity, field innovation preceding institutional adoption, has appeared repeatedly in military history. The question worth asking is not merely historical. What doctrinal assumptions might prove similarly inadequate when tested under different terrain, different enemies, and different forms of concealment? George's Winchester offers no answer to that question, but it serves as a reminder that doctrine reflects choices about preparation, resource allocation, and institutional priorities. And those choices have consequences that soldiers in the field ultimately bear.